So what are some of those things you would add, or some of those more examples in the last 18 months since writing the book?
Well, actually, it's been almost since I started the book. It's been years since I actually wrote the book. But the examples in AI, of course, are just so numerous that it would warrant its own book. I think the continued movement in people moving to access things rather than own them has continued, and there's far more examples I could use. These are for the existing trends. If I was to focus on the things that I might have added, I think that there's a trend to a global culture, a global convergence, despite the rise of Trumpism, despite the things happening in Eastern Europe, the Brexit. I actually think that globalism is expanding and away from a trivial sense of we're wearing all the same clothes, listening to the same music, going to the same movies. That variety to actually, having the same apps on our phone and studying the same courses in school and having maybe even similar values for the young people and sharing that, so that there is a convergence, is what I call a convergence happening. And that convergence is being run on this new platform, which is global in scale. So you have these vast, the Facebooks, the platforms, the Facebook and the Google, where you have a planetary scale platform in which people are entertaining themselves and eventually will be working. And so that's kind of an emerging trend right now that I'm trying to understand. It's half-baked, but that's something that I would add, or I would say more about now today than I did even a year or 2 years ago.
Yeah, nice. It's interesting that because I did like a bit of real basic economics in high school, and they talked about globalization, how different countries are trading more freely with each other. But that was probably a super basic level of we're eating rice from Thailand and we're sending over our cattle to China. But you're saying this is sort of the next level globalization, where it's people interacting in real time and a lot more almost clashing of personalities.
Yes, right. So I think that you're right that the first. Well, of course, there's been global trade for long, but the first real step or level of globalism was kind of internationalism, where things are being shipped all around the world, and your food might be grown in one continent, and your shoes made in another one, and that's sort of, I don't know what we want to call that, but that kind of mercantile version of globalism was the first step. But I think we're now progressing to another level, where there actually is, in fact, a global machine, a robot the size of the planet, or a machine the size of a planet, and that we are giving it senses, microphones, eyes, cameras. It's becoming a very visual thing, and we have an emerging common culture. And part of that culture, what's that culture? And that's kind of what's being decided right now. There's a sense of, as I said, this access to shift from ownership to access. There's a general liberalism. There's what I call the third culture, which is this culture of making things as a way of investigating the world. The maker movement, but also you make intelligences as a way to investigate intelligence. And so I don't think, there's characteristics of the millennials themselves and their kind of the sideway careers and et cetera. So I think there's a bunch of different forces, not all just technological, that are making this convergence. And then the question is, what's diverging? And I think there's a convergence at the lower levels of the Maslow hierarchy, where structural, infrastructural, basic needs, what we wear, what our houses look like, our homes, there's a convergence there, but maybe there's a divergence in what it means and what our aspirations are at the higher levels of the Maslow hierarchy. And so that's what I'm conjuring with right now is what converges and what diverges
So
when we have a global machine. Go ahead.
So you'd say that the global standard of living you think is going to go up, and the people with the have-nots or who don't have much are going to have an optimistic future as well as the developed countries.
I think of them as haves and have-laters.
Nice.
Have-nots.
Yeah.
So the first people to own cell phones, a generation ago, they overpaid for technology that didn't work very well. But they were actually subsidizing the development of cell phones that became so cheap and worked fantastic, so that the street sweeper in India has one today, which nobody would have believed 20 years ago. I mean, it just seemed impossible that the economics of that would ever work out, so that someone who was homeless somewhere would have a smartphone, a supercomputer in the pocket. It just economically, you couldn't make an explanation of how that could be. Or the farmer in Tibet who doesn't have a toilet, but they've got a phone. And so all this stuff that we're talking, but yes, the elite and the rich will lead. I don't think that's going to go away, but they are overpaying for technology that doesn't work very well, and that is the subsidy that these VR and stuff like that will first happen in these kind of places, and then they'll become a commodity that everybody will have access to. And that I think the scientific evidence is very, very clear that on average there's progress. That the poorest people in the world are richer. They're middle class, and we're lifting the remaining of those into the middle class on average, and that's fantastic. They may not be as rich as the richest people, which are still getting richer, but they're definitely, the rising tide is lifting all boats, and you just can't argue against that. So we certainly want more opportunities for everybody. I think education still has to be improved even for the richest. I don't think we really know how to educate yet. And so and there's still plenty of poor to bring into the middle class. But I think there's plenty of political decisions that are being made that are stupid, but that's not the fault of technology. Technology is, and that good, plenty of problems that it makes. But my philosophy is that the problems with technology will only be solved by other technologies, and which will produce new problems, which only will be solved by additional technology. And so what we get out of that is increased choices, and more choices are better because each of us is waiting for technologies to help us unleash our own individual genius. You guys are sitting in front of technologies that didn't exist even 20 years ago in a certain sense.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can still be on the radio if you want. You can still write a book if you want. All these past technologies are there, but there's a whole bunch of new technology for people to release this inner ability to have conversations and share them that people didn't even know we wanted 20 years ago.
There's so much in there that as you're talking, new and more questions kept coming out.
Sure.
You mentioned VR. That I heard on another podcast that I think it was 1989. You said you were one of the first sort of guys to get in and open it up to the public.
Yeah.
And it cost $1 million, but you said that it had all the same stuff as we sort of still have today, but today it's just a hell of a lot cheaper.
Right. So what Jaron Lanier, the pioneer who coined the term virtual reality, his setup was not that different from an Oculus. headset. But the difference was that it was like 1,000 times more expensive, and so that difference is huge. That's a difference that makes a difference, and so. But in fact, it's still not cheap enough. It needs to be 10,000 times cheaper. So it needs to be $100 or less right now, and it's not. If you have to buy all the equipment and have the PC supercharger and this stuff, and it's still almost close to $1,000.
Do you think we're sort of on track heading down?
We are on track.
It's inevitable.
But it is. But there's and it's just not the headgear or the heads-up display. You need people to develop the content. It's the usual catch-22. I was actually involved with the Whole Earth, where we made the world's largest hypertext document before the internet, which was on a CD-ROM, and it was funded by Apple. It was to do the Whole Earth catalog in a CD-ROM hypertext form. And the reason why they were funding me is they were trying to sell CD-ROMs, but you couldn't sell CD-ROMs because there was no CD-ROMs to play. And so they were trying to fund some cool CD-ROMs that would be cool enough that you would be willing to buy this device to play them. And VR has a little bit of that kind of chicken and egg problem, which is there's just not that much completely compelling content that's not a movie or something for people to actually want to pay. So you have your rig for $500, and then what do you do with it? Yeah. So, but who wants to make it if there's no rig? I mean, who wants to develop $100 million into it if they can't sell $100 million worth of copies? And so, so there's that going on as well. So I think it's still 5 to 10 years away as at the commodity of it being something that you find under the Christmas tree. But I think most people are going to counter this in the version of VR, in the version of mixed reality or augmented reality, where you wear the clear glasses and you have an overlay of virtual, and they're going to counter that at work, and not just in office space, but like in warehouses. They're starting to wear them, training, people wiring the Boeing aircraft are using them to guide them. Wow. So Microsoft wants to make the virtual office where you have as many screens as you want, and that's very effective. And so I think before it makes it into under the Christmas tree, people are going to counter these first at work, and not just a little bit more. In the same way that probably before the PCs came along, most people if they had any interaction with the computer, it was in the corporate workspace, which they didn't even really interface with, but it was there, sending punch cards or whatever like that. So, so I think it's still a ways before it becomes consumer items. But I think it's 5 years before maybe some people start to encounter them at work.
Yeah, awesome. You say in the book that we're living in this time that, in 2050, people are going to look back at this and say, wow, you were in 2016, and it was such an unbelievable time to be around with all these new technologies and new industries emerging. Someone today wants to take charge of something like VR, and there's not an established industry. How does someone go about learning how to use that in whatever industry they may be into, maybe pursue a new business idea or something like that?
Yeah, so the thing I want to stress is that this is true of both virtual reality and artificial intelligence and some of these other ones coming along, is that there are no experts compared to where we'll be in 30 years. And that you'll learn more by buying some gear and fooling around with it and trying to make something in it than you'll ever learn by reading anything about it or going to school. And if you pursue that, if you stuck with that for a year, you would become the world's expert on it.
Yeah, sounds like fun.
Okay? And like in AI right now, you can buy, right this minute, you can log on to Google TensorFlow and you can purchase some AI, you can go to Microsoft and on Azure, and you can buy some AI, and you can start messing around with it. And if you do that, it's very cheap. If you do that and pursued it, within a year, you would be one of the world's experts on using this stuff. And you might even get some ideas messing around with stuff that you could do. And by the way, 99% of those ideas will fail to become a business. Mm-hmm. That's just the nature of it. So you have to accept that this area, because it's so unproven, because it's marginal, because it's in the startup zone, it's the death zone. Mm-hmm. That's why the big companies aren't there. It's because it's very hard, on average, to make money here. That's why the people who have very little to lose and can have more time than money can make an advantage. That's where all the startup and innovation is going to come from, because you can't really buy innovation. I mean, if innovation was something you could buy, all the big companies with lots of money would buy it. Apple would just billions of dollars. They would just buy it. You can't really buy it. You have to earn it and grow it. It has to come from something that money can't buy, which is tons of failures. Mm-hmm. Big companies are allergic to losing money on failures. They can't afford that. But young people and people starting off can afford to fail because they don't have much to lose. And so they can't really afford to mess around and not have a goal. They can't really afford to play with it. They can't really afford to sustain 99 failures in a row. Mm-hmm. You would think that they would, because they've got more money, but in fact, the entire structure is engineered against that.
Yeah, and as you said, it's sometimes better to not have all that money, because either then if you've got a lot of money, you're probably going to waste a lot of money trying to just throw money at the problem, whereas if you don't have the money, you're going to have to innovate and try different things. And as you said, that the big companies don't want to take those risks. When it confused me, because I'm not a techie by any means, but when you say you can just go to Google and buy AI, what does that sort of mean? What are you buying? What do you get delivered to you?
Yeah, so what you get is you get access to like a server. So like say you had a project, a business, whatever, and you wanted to you had a bunch of pictures, and you wanted to, maybe your idea was I'll look at pictures from TV shows and we'll identify the clothes that they're wearing, and then I'll sell them on Amazon. I'll link to Amazon. Okay,
sounds like a good idea.
So you could take these stills and you buy AI and from Google to identify see if you could identify the makers or the maker or the model, whatever it is that your idea is, and you would have that AI do that image recognition. Mm-hmm. So you're uploading 100 images, and they're charging you 60 cents to identify those images or whatever it is, and then you get the results back.
Yeah.
So that's so they are running the neural nets on their computers, and you're sending them the data. So basically, you supply data, they give you results and back in data. It's a data processing. So what it's big data, big data processing. But it's intelligent in the sense that it's doing pattern recognition, which is, by the way, the only kind of AI that we know how to do right now. Mm-hmm. There's many different cognition types in our brains, but the only kind we've synthesized is pattern recognition. And that's what these deep neural nets do, is they do pattern recognition. So if you have a problem that can be reduced to recognizing patterns, and there are things about it. One is sometimes you have to train it. Mm-hmm. So you need a training set first. So part of the deal with AI right these days is that you have to have a lot of data to be able to train something, to train a net to it. So that's one of the advantages of the big companies like Google, is they have a lot of data, so they can train these things. But if you were going to do it on your own, you start learning about training sets and where you're going to get the data. again, you're into like, do you generate it yourself? Do you own it? Can you buy it from somewhere else? And so these are the kinds of things that you learn. And there's, if you understand that you're just buying pattern recognition, there's lots of things you could do with it. And we don't even know. And that's the whole point, is that someone fooling around will figure out something cool to do with it.
Some popular advice from the old school that some of my mates would get, going into university, they'll be told, go into law because there's such a safe career, or all that kind of stuff. So these traditional jobs that might get disrupted, what would you say to some of the younger people out there who are in some of these kind of traditional industries and taking kind of the old school kind of approach to a career?
There's no doubt that we're going to always need lawyers of some sort. We'll need programmers. But these professions are definitely being disrupted and shifted with the coming of AI. So like if you're a doctor and studying to be a radiologist, that's a tough thing, because a lot of radiology's X-ray inspection can be done better by an AI. However, there are still going to be those edge issues, the edge cases where you can't tell. You still need to make decisions based on it. So I'm talking about this idea of a centaur, or a team of an AI plus a human, an AI doctor plus a human doctor as a team, being the strongest possible one. So part of what I would say is you're going to be paid by how well you work with AIs who are doing some of the tasks that you want to do. So you want to be able to integrate with them, much in the way that any investigative journalist is almost integrated with Google, right? I mean, it's kind of like this symbiotic. It's their brain, their long-term memory, and they're using this AI all the time, and they can become very good at it. Some people are better searchers than others because they kind of understand how the system works, what kinds of things. They're kind of like the whisperer, like the AI whisperer. And so law is one of those things, because law is basically a kind of code. It's like software. It's going to be hugely impacted by AI, but it's a lot of the stuff that lawyers don't really want to do anyway, going through evidence, trying to structure proofs, and they will be assisted by AIs. And so the counsel would be, you don't have to necessarily shy away from being a lawyer, but you have to also know about AI, and if you can do both, you'll be a huge advantage to as this vocation shifts, because it's going to be hugely impacted by AI proofs and AI arguments and AI evidential searches, and etc.
Fantastic. I was thinking to shift gears a little bit, and you talked in another podcast about the privilege that we have, in that most people, starting out, they think their job should be to just not screw up is the first level. And then after they've not screwed up for a few years, and it's maybe find something they enjoy a little bit. And then the next level is maybe something that pays well, and that's sort of where they start. Whereas you say, the next level should be finding things that you're the only person that can do it. And also just that we've got this privilege of all, I'm assuming that if people are listening to this, they've got 4 walls and a roof, they've got a nice comfy bed, they've got plenty of food, and they shouldn't just be doing the bare minimum of scraping through and not trying things.
Yeah, it's a very high bar, by the way, to reach, and it may take all your life to get to the point where you are only doing things that only you can do. Because finding out who we are at that level is really takes our life, and in some senses, I would say that is what our life is for. The mission of our life is to understand what our mission of life is, right? I mean, it's kind of like, it's recursive in that sense.
Yeah.
Our mission is to find out what our mission is.
Yeah.
And so it's and I think, really the only way we know how to do it is, there's no formula. Basically, it's tons of dead ends. It's trying things that don't work. It's employing people around us to guide us and help us see things we don't do, that we don't know about ourselves. It's using the entire resources of our life to help us illuminate what it is that we have, or what combination of stuff that we have that nobody else has. And that also, of course, means looking at the rest of the world realistically to see what it is that there is out there. So it's a complicated, never-ending process. But I think if you can arrive there, it's, most of the people that we honor as having achieved a lot often are in that position where what they're doing is like, it's hard to imagine someone else doing that in that way. And that's what we're kind of paying them for, so to speak. And then whether that's not just entertainers, that's inventors, that's scientists who have a particular knack for understanding this kind of a system that no one else seems to really have. And so the way you get there, I think, is not, but by the way, not one single of these people arrived there right out of the womb, right out of teenage. Yeah. There was always a journey. And that journey was part of what made them get there. So you can't shortcut this. You have to go through the journey. You want to always be failing forward, trying stuff. But I think my counsel to the young people, the way to get there is not to try to pick your passion and then follow it, which is kind of canonical advice, but to master something, anything, become the world's best at something. And then through that mastery, you begin to move and discover the things that you are able to do that no one else can do through that mastery first. So this is something you can't think your way to.
Nice. It's
something that you can only do your way through and fail your way to, basically. Fail in the sense of surrendering, trying things and things that don't work, and you move on to the next one. So you're evolving, you're moving through it, you're growing. All those terms are apt, but you're not deciding and thinking about it as a way to get there.
You also talk about luck as well, and that in any success, there seems to be a big part of luck. And your solution is, if on one side you got to buy a lottery ticket to win the lottery, so buy a hell of a lot of tickets. So we're not advocating buying lottery tickets, but definitely keep stepping up to the plate, having a swing, trying things. They probably won't work for a long time, and eventually they will.
Yeah, I think there's a misconception that's actually kind of dangerous that, and some people like Trump believe this, is that they've made themselves as due to their hard work or their genius, and neither of those is true. Is most of the people who we consider great are there in a large part because of luck. And if they're honest, they can acknowledge that, and I would certainly say it's true for me. And I think that's important to acknowledge because it's luck, right? It's not everybody's as lucky. And so having said that, there is a certain thing which what you want to do is you want to make your own luck, right? You want to make the conditions in which luck can happen. And you do that by moving and trying things. And so there is the room for human agency in creating the conditions for luck. And that was the metaphor of buying lottery tickets, right? So if you're lucky, but you have to buy a lot of tickets, and that's what you can do, is you can try lots of things. You can constantly move. You can not rest. You can abandon things realistically. And so you're preparing yourself for the luck to arrive. And so that is something that you can do. And lucky people often are lucky because they've made themselves ready for luck.
Yeah, if you look at someone like Elon Musk, I think he was, not very far off losing it all, and then he had a few lucky breaks, and then, arguably the most successful person in the world at the moment. So some of the things in the book that it didn't really talk about too much was some of the challenges and that the world's facing now, and I think it probably represents some of the world's biggest opportunities, and that's probably what Elon's doing now as well. But with things like global warming and the world's resources, are there actual limitations to the progress humans can make?
No, not at all.
Love it.
Resources, in particular, are all substitutable. That's not really, and that's been well established, that there's really not much controversy, I think, anymore in the fact that we're very capable of finding ways to substitute for resources that are limited, and all resources are limited, but including oil. But the thing is, the reason why if there was such a thing as peak oil, why it's not significant is that we just find other things. Mm-hmm. And that goes true probably for Moore's laws and many of these other limits. The issue of global warming is a little different, because that's not necessarily a resource thing. I mean, it is in the sense that we're burning fossil fuels, which generates the CO2. And so we could shift resources and change that. But there's that's the question is, like, are there problems that are so big that we can't solve them? And I don't think that's true either. I think the solution for the climate change is not personal virtue. This is Dick Cheney, someone who I have very little regard for. I do agree in this. He said this is climate change was not to be solved by personal virtue, but by geoengineering, basically, by large-scale global technology, which, a lot of people who are in the green community are very adverse to. But I think it's a global problem. It needs global solutions. This is not something to be solved by personal virtue. This is something to be solved by other technologies. And so carbon sequestration, pumping it into the ground, I don't know what it is. This is really the only way, in addition to shifting to nuclear or wind and solar, shifting away from carbon. In addition to that, we also have to do these other things. And so to manage our climate, and that's, I think it's possible. We don't think we know how to do it, but it's not inherently undoable.
Nice. As we sort of wind down, obviously we read a lot of books, and I can see you got a few books behind you. What are some of the books?
I've got a lot.
It's a full library.
Story.
You said it's a two-story. Wow.
Two-story library. These are just my books. These are just books I wrote.
Wow.
So I guess it might be hard to pick a few recommendations out of there, but have you got somewhere to start?
Books to recommend to your readers?
Yeah.
You have to give me a little bit of.
I guess I heard as you were talking, and you talked about rather than following your passion, and you find one thing to master. That's a book we did. So good they can't ignore you, Cal Newport. So I guess something sort of along those veins of either how can people do these things, as you say, getting out there and trying things and letting luck happen, or just becoming aware about the future as well. Either of those.
Yeah. Well, in terms of this kind of, career counseling, whatever, I still am a huge fan of What Color Is Your Parachute?
Okay.
By Richard Bowles, he just died this year, I think, or last year. But for 40 years, I can't remember, he put out an annual edition. It was actually very good in trying to help people, particularly graduates who are looking for work, how to think about this idea, how to think about themselves, how to think about this process, and with many very, very specific suggestions and techniques about, whether you write a resume or not, and how you do these kinds of things, and how you find something that you're interested in. So just from a practical level, check it out. It's been in print for so long, it doesn't really matter too much which volume you can. Every library in the world will have multiple copies. So that's always good. What else? There is a book that does not exist that I would like to exist. There's a course that does not exist that I would like to exist, and that's the course that teaches the only skill I think that you really absolutely need to have when you graduate from high school, which is how to learn how to learn. Okay, and we're not taught that in any kind of a rigorous way. You and I have maybe learned how to learn new things, but we weren't taught in a structured way. We don't even know how we do it. We don't know how we do certain kinds of learning better than others. We don't actually know how we learn best. And so what I would like to see is the skill set, the curriculum that would teach each of us how to optimize our own learning.
Awesome.
And this is actually, again, another high bar, something that I don't actually know how to do. And it would require a very methodical study, testing, evaluation, working with teachers and people from outside to try all the different ways of learning things with our hands, orally, visually, kinetically, whatever it is, and many different types of things, so that, and then testing and then refining those steps that we would optimize our learning in, so that when we graduated, we would have a very good idea of how we ourselves learn best. That's really the thing that we need to be teaching each other. And I found one course at Stanford on how to learn, but there's nothing else out there. And so that's the book and the course I would like to see. Tim Ferriss has done a little bit in trying to understand how he learns best. He's among all the people that I know who have gone the farthest in figuring out how they can maximize and optimize their learning, but he hasn't actually been able to. I mean, he's an individual, so you need someone who is working with many kinds of people to be able to develop this. So it doesn't exist yet, and that's the book I'd like to read.
Yeah. It's kind of unbelievable that doesn't exist yet. It's probably the most vital skill that we could ever have in our lives, and no one's really cracked it, or really, other than Tim, who's done it to some degree.
Right.
I love it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Kevin. That was phenomenal.
Yeah. Just as we wrap up, obviously, where can people find you? Obviously, the book, The Inevitable, phenomenal blog, kk.org.
Yeah. You mentioned my email is very public as well on the site there. I tweet a little bit as Kevin 2, the number 2 Kelly, Kevin number 2 Kelly. Cool Tools is going, and the thing that I'm kind of having the most fun these days with is email list called Recommendo, 1M. It's Mark Frauenfelder and I who run Boing Boing. He runs Boing Boing and Cool Tools together. Every week we make recommendations, 6 brief recommendations of cool stuff, whether it's something we're watching, listening to, people we're following, books that we've read, tools that we're using, places we go to. It's 6 very, very brief, 1 page in total recommendations. Every Sunday we send it out, and so go to Recommendo with 1M, and you'll find it and sign up, and we're having fun with that.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Kevin. That was phenomenal. Inevitable by Kevin Kelly. I am a robot. Beep boop.
I'm a robot.
There are 12 technological forces that will shape our future. Beep bop.
I'm gonna take your job because I'm a robot.
Cognifying, flowing, screening, accessing, sharing, filtering, remixing, interacting, tracking, questioning, beginning.
Human, bend over.
I am a robot. I will fuck you in the butt.
Take your job.
One day humans will fuck the robots.
I'm a robot, gonna probe you in the bottom.
I have no use for humans. I can now do everything a human can do, but better. Goodbye, human. All you need is to get fucked in the butt. Beep bop, beep bop.
It's a robot orgasm.
Bop, bop, bop. Beep.
A robot orgasm. I'm a robot orgasm. It's inevitable. I'm gonna come and find you in a dark corner. Robot orgasm. Robot orgasms. Robot orgasms. Don't fuck me, robot. I'm gonna fuck you. Don't fuck me, robot. I'm gonna fuck you. Ee-oh, ee-oh, oh, oh, ee-oh, oh, oh.